Welcome to the session on Aesthetic Theory of Kant, Part 2. The discordance of art and truth has been a perennial issue for the philosophers since the dawn of philosophy. Nietzsche characterizes this condition as, "Very early in my life, I took the question of the relation of art to truth seriously. Even now, I stand in holy dread in the face of this discordance." It is in the theories of Kant, especially in his Critique of Judgment, we see for the first time an attempt to overcome the alienation of art from truth. Kant's third critique attempts to carve out and constitute the domain of the aesthetic in its wholly modern signification. In securing an autonomous domain of aesthetic judgment, Kant was simultaneously securing the independence of the domains of cognition and moral worth from aesthetic interference. Immanuel Kant, German Enlightenment philosopher, whose original and powerful philosophy has influenced most of the later Western thought. Kant produced an early treatise on aesthetics, Observations on the Feeling of the Beautiful and the Sublime, and did not write on the subject again until the end of his career in the Critique of Judgment. His influential critical philosophy developed in between these two works. Though Kant conceived the Critique of Judgment as the key work which connected his writings on epistemology, the theory of knowledge, in the Critique of Pure Reason, with his writings on ethics in the Critique of Practical Reason, it is not necessary to know these other works in order to understand the most influential parts of Kant's aesthetics. Like most of the other 18th century writers, Kant focused not in aesthetics per se, but in the concepts of beauty and sublime. He argues that it is our faculty of judgment that enables us to have experience of beauty and grasp those experiences as part of an ordered natural world with purpose. It is impossible to discuss all of his philosophical ideas as they extend over a number of different philosophical regions: epistemology, metaphysics, aesthetics, ethics, politics, and religion. What follows here will be a brief account of Kant's key concepts in the field of aesthetics. Kant was born in Königsberg, Prussia in 1724 to Lutheran parents. His early education, first at a pietist school and then at the University of Königsberg, was in theology. But soon he developed a liking for physics. Finishing degree, he entered academic life as a lecturer. He continued to work and lecture on and publish widely on a great variety of issues, but especially on physics and on the metaphysical issues behind physics and mathematics. In the late 1760s and in his inaugural dissertation of 1770, Kant began to move towards the ideas that would make him famous and change the face of philosophy. He published the first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason in 1781. Over the next 2 decades, he furiously pursued his new philosophy into different territories, producing books or shorter publications on various philosophical topics. This new philosophy came to be known as critical or transcendental philosophy. Among these publications, of particular importance were the so-called 3 critiques: the Critique of Pure Reason, Critique of Practical Reason, and the Critique of Judgment. The various themes of the Critique of Judgment have been enormously influential in the 2 centuries since its publication. For example, the accounts of genius and of the significance of imagination in aesthetics became the tenets of Romanticism in the early 19th century. In the first half of the 20th century, the formalism of Kant's aesthetics in general inspired 2 generations of formalist aesthetics. The judgment of the beautiful. The critique of judgment begins with an account of beauty. It starts the discussion with analyzing the nature of that judgment, which results in our appreciating something as beautiful. Kant argues that such aesthetic judgments or judgments of taste must have 4 key distinguishing features. First, they are disinterested, which means that we take pleasure in something because we judge it beautiful, rather than judging it beautiful because we find it pleasurable. In short, it is not an aesthetic judgment when you say, "I like chocolates." Second and third, such judgments are both universal and necessary. This roughly indicates that it is an intrinsic part of the activity of such a judgment to expect others to agree with us. Further, Kant insists that universality and necessity are in fact a product of features of the human mind. Kant calls these features common sense, and that there is no objective property of a thing that makes it beautiful. Fourth feature is that through aesthetic judgments, beautiful objects appear to be purposive without purpose. Here, Kant argues that it is part of the experience of beautiful objects that they should affect us as if they had a purpose, although no particular purpose can be found. In other words, beautiful objects are not like those objects which are designed for special purposes. After introducing the distinguishing features of aesthetic judgment, Kant proceeds to analyze such questions as to how such judgments are possible and are such judgments in any way valid? That is, are they really universal and necessary? Here, it is useful to see Kant's thoughts on aesthetics as a leap over the debate between the philosophy of British empiricists and that of the rationalists. The key ideas of British empiricists were: first one, studies of beauty could within limits be universal in scope. Second, our response to beautiful objects were associated with sense or feeling and were not cognitive. Third, any natural responses to beauty were generally overlaid by individual and communal experiences, habits, and customs. Baumgarten disagrees with empiricists and argues that all sense perceptions are merely confused cognition or cognition by way of sensible images. Kant distinguishes intuitive or sensible perceptions and conceptual or rational perceptions. Kant holds that aesthetic experience is inexplicable without both an intuitive and a conceptual dimension. Kant's initial focus is on judgments about beauty in nature. What does such a judgment mean when we call a flower or a sunset beautiful? How does this judgment take place as a mental act? In order to find answers of these questions, Kant tries to clarify the basic features of such judgments. Kant discusses 4 particular unique features of aesthetic judgments on the beautiful. He calls them moments. The first moment: aesthetic judgments are disinterested. there are two types of interest, by way of sensations in the agreeable and by way of concepts in the good. Interest is defined as a link to real desire and action, and thus also to a determining connection to the real existence of the object. According to Kant, aesthetic judgment is free or pure of any such interest. Your wish to own a beautiful object because you derive pleasure from it is not an aesthetic judgment. The judgment results in pleasure rather than pleasure resulting in judgment. Kant claims that the aesthetic judgment must concern itself only with form, shape, arrangement, rhythm, etc. in the object presented, not sensible content, color, tone, etc., since the latter has a deep connection to the agreeable and thus to interest. Kant can thus be considered as the founder of formalism in modern aesthetics. However, his claim of disinterestedness has been questioned by later thinkers. For example, according to Nietzsche and Freud, all art must always be understood as related to will, and for Marxists, art as a cultural production is related to the political and economic condition of society. The second moment, aesthetic judgments behave universally. It expects the agreement of others. Being reflective judgments, aesthetic judgments of taste have no adequate concept, at least to begin with, and therefore can only behave as if they were objective. Kant, in order to make the point clear, introduces the idea of free play of cognitive factors. In the case of the judgment of the beautiful, these faculties no longer simply work together as they do in ordinary sensible cognition, but rather each furthers or quickens the other in a kind of self-contained and self-perpetuating cascade of thought and feeling. The third moment, it introduces the problem of purpose and purposiveness. An object's purpose is the concept according to which it was manufactured. Purposiveness then is the property of at least appearing to have been manufactured or designed. Kant claims that the beautiful has to be understood as purposive, but without any definite purpose. A definite purpose would be either the set of external purposes, what the thing was meant to do or accomplish, or the internal purpose, what the thing was simply meant to be like. Kant argues that beauty is equivalent neither to utility nor perfection, but is still purposive. It appears as purposive with respect to our faculty of judgment, but it is not purposive with respect to determinate cognition. In the case of judgment of art, though the purposiveness of a work of art can be considered as the background, it must be abstracted to form the aesthetic judgment properly. It is not just that the purpose for the beauty of the beautiful happens to be unknown, but that it cannot be known. The fourth moment, the aesthetic judgments must be a necessary judgment. By this, Kant holds that aesthetic judgment should be according to principle. Further, he argues that this necessity is of a peculiar sort. It is exemplary and conditioned. By exemplary, Kant means that the judgment does not either follow or produce a determining concept of beauty, but exhausts itself in being exemplary precisely of an aesthetic judgment. With the notion of condition, Kant tries to explore what is it that the necessity of the judgment is grounded upon? That is, what does it say about those who judge? Kant calls the ground common sense, by which he means the a priori principle of our taste. Kant also wants to claim that the universal communicability, the exemplary necessity, and the basis in a priori principle are all different ways of understanding the same subjective condition of possibility of aesthetic judgment that he calls common sense. Kant also suggests that common sense in turn depends upon or is perhaps identical with the same faculties as ordinary cognition. Here, however, the faculties are merely in a harmony rather than forming determinate cognition. Mehmet Atale writes, Kant seems to view the notion of a sensus communis or common sense as the common root of our external senses and a capacity for judgment that unites these external senses regarding a given object. A capacity for judgment that is based on our feelings belongs only to the cases regarding aesthetics, that is, the judgment of taste. This principle applies only to aesthetics, since the sensus communis is based on our feelings. How does aesthetic judgment happen? Kant argues that judgment itself as a faculty has a fundamental principle that governs it. It assumes in advance that everything we experience can be tackled by our powers of judgment. Though normally we don't notice this assumption, in the case of the beautiful, we notice it. Since the beautiful has no concept of a purpose available, we cannot just apply a concept and be done with it. The beautiful forces us to search for concepts that we can never find. The beautiful, nevertheless, is a pleasurable experience. The principle of purposiveness is satisfied, but in a new and unique way. The difference between ordinary and aesthetic cognition is that, in the latter case, there is no one determinate concept that specifies an intuition. Instead, intuition is allowed some free play, and rather than being subject to one concept, it acts in harmony with the lawfulness in general of the understanding. It is this ability of judgment to bring sensibility and understanding to a mutually reinforcing harmony that Kant calls common sense. Kant says, in the logical power of judgment, one subsumes under concepts, but in the aesthetic power of judgment, one subsumes under a relation that is merely a matter of sensation, that of the imagination and the understanding reciprocally attuned to each other, represented form of the object, where the subsumption can easily be deceptive. Again, to quote Mehmet Atale, according to Kant, since the feeling of aesthetic taste is universally communicable, it creates an interest to beauty which is disinterested. Since every interest contains a relation to our way of existence, there is an existential tendency in humans towards beauty. In other words, our feeling of the aesthetic sense must have a close connection to our way of existence. In the phenomenon of beauty, our mind discovers that nature reflects a kind of purposiveness for us. Our mind sees that its own faculties have an objective reality, and so it is unconditionally interested in the presence of beauty. In nature, the person that takes pleasure from the form of beauty, which is a product of nature, takes a disinterested pleasure from the presence of this product too. The sublime. The sublime names experiences like violent storms or huge buildings which seem to overwhelm us. According to Kant, it is the other basic type of aesthetic experience. It is either the size or the dynamism by which we are overwhelmed. Then this experience seems to directly contradict the principle of the purposiveness of nature for our judgment. Kant's solution is that, in fact, the storm or the building is not the real object of the sublime at all. Instead, what is properly sublime are ideas of reason, namely the ideas of absolute totality or absolute freedom. Under the heading of moral culture, Kant argues that the whole sublime experience would not be possible if humans had not received a moral training that taught them to recognize the importance of their own faculty of reason. Kant divides the sublime into the mathematical and the dynamical. The mathematical sublime is defined as something absolutely large. The absolutely large, however, is not the result of a comparison. Kant claims that the relation of the overwhelming sensible object to our sense is in a kind of harmony or analogy to the relation of the rational idea of absolute totality to any sensible object or faculty. Regarding the dynamically sublime, Kant writes that such objects raise the soul's fortitude above its usual middle range and allow us to discover in ourselves an ability to resist which is of a quite different kind. In particular, nature is called sublime merely because it elevates the imagination to the exhibition of those cases wherein the mind can be made to feel the sublimity even above nature, that is, proper to its vocation. Fine art and genius. Kant assumes that the cognition involved in judging fine art is similar to the cognition involved in judging natural beauty. The problem that is new to fine art is not how it is judged by a viewer, but how it is created. In order to solve this problem, Kant introduces two concepts, the genius and aesthetic ideas. Kant argues that art can be tasteful, that is, agree with aesthetic judgment, and yet be soulless, lacking that certain something that would make it more than just an artificial version of a beautiful natural object. What provides soul in fine art is an aesthetic idea. It is the talent of genius to generate aesthetic ideas. The genius must also find a mode of expression which allows a viewer not just to understand the work conceptually, but to reach something like the same excited yet harmonious state of mind that the genius had in creating. While formerly philosophical aesthetics was largely content to take its primary examples of beauty and sublimity from nature, after Kant, the focus is placed squarely on works of art. According to Kant, art refers to the activity of making according to a preceding notion. If I make a chair, I must know in advance what a chair is. We distinguish art from nature because we know, in fact, there is no prior notion behind the activity of a flower opening. Art also means something different from science. As Kant says, it is a skill distinguished from a type of knowledge. Art involves some kind of practical ability irreducible to determinate concepts, which is distinct from a mere comprehension of something. Arts are subdivided into mechanical and aesthetic. The former are those which although not handicrafts, nevertheless are controlled by some definite concept of a purpose to be produced. The latter are those wherein the immediate object is merely pleasure itself. Finally, Kant distinguishes between agreeable and fine art. The former produces pleasure through sensations alone, the latter through various types of cognitions. As a definition of genius, Kant writes, "Genius is the talent or natural endowment that gives the rule to art. Since talent is an innate productive ability of the artist and as such belongs itself to nature, we could also put it this way. Genius is the innate mental predisposition, ingenium, through which nature gives the rule to art." To summarize Kant's concept of art and genius, first, fine art is produced by individual humans, but not as contingent individuals. That is, not by human nature in the empirically known sense. Second, fine art as aesthetic, just like nature as aesthetic, can have no definite rules or concepts for producing or judging it. But genius supplies a rule fully applicable only in the one concrete instance, precisely by way of the universal structures of the genius' mental abilities. Third, the rule supplied by genius is more a rule governing what to produce rather than how. The how is usually heavily informed by training and technique and is governed by taste. Taste, Kant claims, is an evaluative faculty, not a productive one. Fourth, originality is a characteristic of genius. This means also that fine art properly is never an imitation of previous art, though it may follow or be inspired by previous art. Fifth, fine art must have the look of the nature. This is because the rule of its production is radically original. Kant's theory of genius, in particular, the radical separation of the aesthetic genius from the scientific mind, has enormously influential. The link of fine art to a metaphysical content, the requirement of radical originality, all these claims were widespread for well over a century after Kant. Questions. What is the relationship between Kant's aesthetics and formalism in art? Discuss about the concepts of romanticism with reference to Kantian aesthetics. Here are some books for your reference. Kemal Selim, Kant and Fine Art, Oxford, Clarendon Press, 1986. Kemal Selim, Kant's Aesthetic Theory, London, St. Martin's Press, 1992. Geyer Paul edited The Cambridge Companion to Kant, Cambridge, Cambridge University Press, 1992. Crawford, Donald, Kant's Aesthetic Theory, Madison, Wisconsin University Press, 1974. Here we end this session. We'll discuss another topic in the next session. Till then, bye.